When you start thinking about the New Testament, and of course for the past 2 weeks we've looked at the emperors of the first century from Augustus to Domitian, because that is the big picture of what's going on in the world of the New Testament. So aside from how we did the Old Testament, I think with the Old Testament we had to stay big picture, because to get into the world of the Israelites, the Hebrews as a nation, as a people in their world, in their culture, is really to just do a survey of the Old Testament, which is not what this class is over. This is over the biblical backgrounds, or the background of the Bible. So when you move to the New Testament, though, I think we see a not so subtle shift in what happened from the Old Testament to the New Testament. In a lot of ways, we are closer to the New Testament world than the New Testament world was to the Old Testament world. In other ways, we're not. For example, technologically, the New Testament world is very similar to the Old Testament world. You don't really have these major advancements in technology. You have major advancements in philosophy, not necessarily in technology. But as far as religion goes, we're closer today to the world, to the religious world of the New Testament than they were to the religious world of the Old Testament. And I think when we say that to our Bible classes or in our sermons or whatever, I think it really puts it in perspective for us just how drastic the New Testament was as opposed to the Old Testament. So, a couple of weeks ago, we started with the big picture. What's going on in the background? What's going on in Rome? What's all these people dealing with? Because that ultimately does funnel down and influence our stories. But as we take that big picture and begin, as we say, funneling down, I think the next step for us is to look at the major groups in the New Testament that weren't present in the Old Testament. Now, I don't know if you're following that sheet of paper that I gave out on the first day of class, but you might as well throw it away, because the class outline that I came up with, I looked at at the end of last week and I said, no, that ain't going to work. It's just too much for us to talk about and not enough time. So we're just going to start, and wherever we get to, as the Lord wills. So we're going to begin today talking about, I hope, 3 groups. We may not make it past 1, but I hope 3. The first group is the scribes and Pharisees. These are one group. We'll talk about why in just a little bit. It may seem like 2 different groups, and it does in Scripture, but when you look at extra biblical sources, it's one group. Let me turn my clicker on. Who are they? The historian Josephus, who is a first century historian. He's a Jewish man. We rely on Josephus a lot for our extra biblical information about the world of the first century. You have to take Josephus with a grain of salt. He is not always right, but he gives a good picture of what a good Jew would view the world as. Josephus lists 3 different divisions of Jews: Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Think about it today like if you think of the 3 groups of monotheistic religions. You have Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Right? Or maybe within the world of Christianity, you have Protestant, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox. Right? So you have 3 that fit into the one big picture. Okay? So if you were to say, what 3 categories of Jews were there? These are the 3. Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. We know 2 of these from the Bible. Essenes are not mentioned in the Bible, although I do think they're alluded to in the Bible. We'll talk about that when we get there. Now, it is not certain if the scribes and Pharisees were the same group or 2 distinct groups. I believe, along with many other scholars, that they belong to the same category. So let's put it like this. Not all Pharisees are scribes, but all scribes are Pharisees. Does that make sense? So when we read Scripture and we see that the scribes and Pharisees came to Jesus, they're of the same mindset. I would argue the scribes would have a little bit more education because they're writing down the law and the oral law that's being passed down. So they're kind of the top tier. But the Pharisees were understood to be the best of their day, the best Jews of their day. We'll talk about why that is, I think, on the next slide. It is difficult for us to define exactly who the Pharisees were. And I think when we read the New Testament, we give the Pharisees a really hard time as the so-called enemies of Jesus. right? They're just the worst. And we get that largely from what Jesus says. Matthew 25, the great woes to the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus was not, as a matter of fact, if you read about Jesus, it seems like Jesus would fit into the group of Pharisee. And if not the Pharisees, then maybe the Essenes, but most prominently the Pharisees. We would think that they would get along, that Jesus and the Pharisees would get along, but they don't. Jesus doesn't get along with any of the Jewish religious leaders, does he? So it's difficult for us from Scripture to define who the Pharisees were. It's difficult for us to define from extra-biblical sources, but here are three things that we can know about them. Number one, they are religious teachers of the oral Torah. Oral Torah is different from written Torah. The Sadducees were the proponents of the written Torah. The oral Torah involves the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is called the Pentateuch, right? Torah, by the way, is just a Hebrew word for law. So when we refer to the Torah, we're referring to the law of Moses. They not only loved and had a deep appreciation for and study of the written Torah, but the oral law that came with that. So for example, think about the 10 Commandments. I don't know which commandment this is, but honor the Sabbath and keep it holy, right? Well, we know that Jews weren't allowed to work on the Sabbath. So the next logical question is, well, what's work? Well, the Pharisees were responsible with coming up with that oral law and oral tradition that defined these things outside of the law. We would almost say they're the creedal version of the Jews, right? So for example, the Pharisees believe that if you're in your house and you see a stick on the windowsill, I can walk up to that stick and throw it out. This is actually in their oral law. I can throw it out of the window, and that's not work. But if I'm walking down the road headed to my house and I see the stick and I pick it up and put it in the windowsill, that's work. It was against the law for a Jewish woman to undo her hair on the Sabbath because that's work. So all these things that aren't in the law that they came up with in the oral law, the Mishnah, the Talmud, things like that, they were the teachers of that. They also, by the way, not only were devoted to the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, but also to what's called the Ketuvim, which is the law, the prophets, and the writings. So what we would call our Old Testament, they were solely devoted to. That differs from the Sadducees, which we'll see in a little bit, who only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They did not accept the other books as canonical. Okay, we'll talk more about that later. They were concerned with ritualistic purity. I think you see this evidently in Scripture in the New Testament because, take for example, Jesus and his disciples are walking through a field. The disciples pick the heads of grain and eat it on the Sabbath, and what happens? The Pharisees say, "How dare you? That's work. You can't work on the Sabbath." Well, where does that say that in the law? And here's the big thing about Jesus and his disciples. Jesus kept the law perfectly, did he not? He's the only human being who's ever lived to keep the law perfectly. But he doesn't keep the oral tradition perfectly, which shows just how flimsy the oral tradition is, right? Because no one could keep, if no one could keep the law perfect, surely no one could keep the oral tradition perfect either. But they were concerned with that ritualistic purity. Matthew chapter 6, I wrote my master's thesis on Matthew chapter 6. And, oh, I'm sorry. This stand has gotten so flimsy. We'll see if that stays. Matthew chapter 6. I wrote my master's thesis on Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 18, which basically says, Jesus says, it's Sermon on the Mount, right? Jesus says, when you do these 3 things, don't do it before men. Do it before God, right? These 3 things are when you give, when you pray, and when you fast. Each of those 3 give an example of someone, the hypocrite, as he's called, doing these things for personal attention. I believe that that is a shot at the Pharisees because they are the ones who sound the trumpet before they give. They're the ones who literally put makeup on their face to make themselves look like they've fasted longer than they have. We have accounts of Pharisees doing this. So the Pharisees were overly concerned with ritualistic purity to the point of being reflecting on themselves rather than on God. They were seen as the best Jews of their time. The Pharisees are not the bad guy in Scripture. They're not the good guys either, but they're not the bad guy, right? So when we think about Pharisees, these three things give us a really good grouping to work with. There are 7 types of Pharisees that are mentioned in the Talmud. And these 7 types, I'll talk a little bit about each one of them. It's not really important to write this down or to remember this, but this is how Pharisees were understood and the challenge of being a Pharisee. Remember, Paul calls himself in, what is it, Philippians 2 or 3, he was a Pharisee of Pharisees, right? And then he kind of elaborates on that in Acts 22. He studied at the feet of Gamaliel. Here's a danger of being a Pharisee, are these 7, with the exception of number 7. All right, so number 1 is the shouldering Pharisee. The shouldering Pharisee is a Pharisee who bore his good works on his shoulders, right? He wanted to show his good works off to everyone. I think about the parable in Luke chapter 18 where the Pharisee is praying and he lifts his hand up to God and he says, God, thank you so much for not making me like this terrible, sorry, no good tax collector, right? That's a shouldering Pharisee. Number 2 is the delaying Pharisee. The delaying Pharisee lets business wait in order to go out of his way to do a good deed. And the point of this is that him going out of his way to do a good deed draws the attention to himself. It's the exact opposite of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan goes out of his way to do a good deed, but not to draw attention to himself, to solely help his neighbor. This has been compared to Jesus, because Jesus at times will go out of his way to help someone or to do a good deed. I don't think that's a good comparison to make, by the way, but just to get that in our minds. Number 3 is the bruised Pharisee. This is one of my favorites because I wish that our young men had the mental capacity of the bruised Pharisee. Bruised Pharisee is called such because he walks around with his eyes closed and he bumps into walls and he bumps into people. He walks around with his eyes closed to keep from looking at women, to keep from being lustful. Think about Job 31:1. Job says, I've made a covenant with my eyes. How can I look then at a young maiden? So this bruised Pharisee has his sexual purity at the forefront of his mind, and so much so that he was going to walk around with his eyes closed. Number 4 is the pestle Pharisee. This is a Pharisee who shows false humility. We would call it a humble brag. That's exactly what Matthew 6 is all about. I wrote my master's thesis on fasting, and so the fasting passage, and namely verse, I think it's 16 through 18, was really my focal point. And it's amazing to me that we already mentioned it earlier, but that these Pharisees would literally put makeup on themselves to show that to act like they fasted longer than they did. Good Pharisees fasted on, let me see if I can remember this, on Mondays and Thursdays, because that's the day supposedly Moses went up on the mountain and the day that he came down. So, and other Pharisees would fast more often. There was a Roman emperor, and I don't remember which one it is. I think it's Claudius, who said, I can boast because I fast more than the Jews. So the pestle Pharisee is one who puts on this false sense of humility. The ever-reckoning Pharisee asked what good deeds he could do to cancel out his sins. So what can I do to be made righteous in the eyes of God? Well, that just goes completely against Christianity, doesn't it? That just speaks everything against grace and mercy. I compare this to Islam. This is such an Islamic doctrine. If you ask any good Muslim what you have to do to gain access into paradise, an honest Muslim, they will tell you, you have to stand before Allah in judgment and pray that your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds. Do you remember what we talked about with the Egyptian Book of the Dead, that your heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, right? That's Islamic philosophy. The only reason why I'm getting into heaven, and I know that I am, is because the blood of Jesus has washed away my sins, and I can stand before God with Him not seeing me. He's going to see me clothed in Jesus. What a wonderful, wonderful difference. I feel sorry for this kind of Pharisee. Number 6 is the fearful Pharisee. This is the one who lives in terror of God. Kind of like he has... you familiar with having a song play on loop? It just plays over and over and over and over and over again. It's like he has the sermon Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God on loop over and over and over again. He's just scared to death of the power of God. Now, I believe we need to be in awe of the power and even the wrath of God. I really think that, and I think you see that in Romans chapter 3 of all places. But I can have confidence approaching the throne of God, Hebrews chapter 10. And then lastly, this is the only good Pharisee. This is the loving Pharisee. And this is a Pharisee who's depicted very closely with Abraham. So that's the ideal. All these other ones are the types of Pharisees, but the ideal is to be a loving Pharisee. So where did the Pharisees... Go ahead. Yep, go ahead.
Going back to those 7 that you've got there, which one was Saul of Tarsus fallen under?
I have no idea. I have no idea. What do you think?
Well, it's hard to say because, the way you describe what they are, I don't see them really falling under any one of them too well.
Yeah.
As though there should be an 8th one up there somewhere.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wonder, though, since you brought it up, I wonder if Saul, if you're going to force him into one, and I don't think you can, but if you're going to force him into one of these categories, I would probably put him in the category of the of either the ever-reckoning or the fearful. Saul, even post-conversion, I don't think ever got over his persecution of the church. He brings it up in his letters. He's very remorseful in his letters. And knowing that he has salvation, knowing that he's been forgiven, he still has kind of that ghost in the background. So if you had to fit him into one of these, that might be it. Although, I do wonder if the loving Pharisee is to be the ideal, perhaps Saul would have fit in that, because he was, as he says, a Pharisee of Pharisees. It's almost like he, in Philippians 3, is showing the reader, even though it's a Gentile audience, I was the best of the Pharisees. I think that might go beyond being the smartest of the Pharisees, or being the most well-educated, or the best trained, or whatever. So that's a great question. Let's put a number 8. Let's think about that.
Because to me, he was one that's more, I don't see one up here that says, he was really, unless I misunderstood something. Now, he was one that was, he loved God so much that he was willing to defend.
Very zealous.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't see one there that really says, that they were a zealous Pharisee, that they would go to the extent of going after anything that was contrary.
Right. So, I think one of the reasons you don't see that is because at this particular time, when this list in the Talmud is given, we're talking about the intertestamental period, those 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, the church is not a threat at the time. And really within Judaism, you don't have a threat. Your threat comes from the outside, from Greece and then ultimately Rome, which forms the zealot group, does it not? And we'll talk about them a little bit later. So, but we can't call Paul. This is the problem with Paul. He never fits perfectly in one box. He doesn't fit in the box of a Roman citizen, even though he is. He doesn't fit in the box of a Jew, even though he is. He doesn't fit really in the box of a Christian, even though he is, because he's in the boxes of the other two. He just stands at the pinnacle of everything. Oh, what an amazing person.
Think about the ever-reckoning thing. And that seems to be like an idea that a lot of people today hold.
Yeah.
And, like I said, even with Paul, he kind of had that too in the back of his mind. I talked to some Christians that felt like there are even people that want to obey the gospel because they feel like their sins outweigh all the good in their life.
Mm-hmm.
They want to try to counteract that to some degree before they commit themselves to Christianity. But it just seems like a very present thing in our world today. That's the kind of idea that any religious person would almost have.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's crazy because, I know a lot of great people who are members of the Lord's church, and if you go up to them and you ask them, are you going to heaven? Most of the time, especially for the older generation, they will say, well, I hope so. Now, I don't hope so, I know so. And that's not being arrogant. I know so because of what John writes in 1 John 1:7, that it's a conditional sentence. That if I walk in the light as He is in the light, we have fellowship with one with another, and the blood of Jesus cleanses me from all sin. Now, if I walk in the light, that's the condition, right? But I know that I have that forgiveness of sin because Christians sin. Well, we're not perfect, but we have that if we're walking in the light. Now, the minute we stop walking in the light and we start sinning and continually sinning, I think you got a different story there. So don't misunderstand me. But absolutely, absolutely. And what you said there about people saying, well, I don't want to become a Christian because I'm too bad. Listen, we talked about Paul. Have you killed somebody? And even if you have you been responsible for probably hundreds of people dying? Have you stood there and held the coats of the men who killed someone? Probably not. And I know all sin is equal, but if we're talking to someone about this, it's just one of the...
Somebody that he had his wife was a faithful Christian for a long time, and he would come to church with her or something, but he never obeyed the gospel. And so we went and visited him for something. She had had surgery or something, so we went and visited with them. And we got to talking to him, and we were talking to him about the importance of obeying the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Baptized, and he said, "Well, I know what I need to do, but I feel like I need to, write a letter." He wanted to write a letter confessing his sins and things, and he kind of had it, obviously it had come from denominations and some other background, but he felt like he needed to confess all those things before he could obey the gospel. And I think he did later on. I think he was finally baptized, but. Wasn't that night, not by anything we said, but.
Well, I wonder if we've done, sorry we're getting off topic, but this is good to talk about. I wonder if we've done a disservice. I want to be careful how I say this, because I believe if someone comes up to you and they say, I want to be baptized, we need to talk to them about why. Do you really understand? Do you really believe? Are you really repentant? But I think what we've done is, and I'm not saying we here just, Christianity, what we've done is we've said, okay, well, in order to be baptized, take this test, take this class, fill out this form, meet so many times with the preacher or elders, and then we will baptize you, which, by the way, delays the urgency of baptism. But I think people have taken that to say, I have to be a certain level of moral good before I can be baptized. Well, listen, before baptized, you are no moral good. There is no such thing as moral good in you in comparison to God. That's Romans 3. That all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and that we are due His wrath. When we're saved, we are not saved from the devil. We aren't saved from, from immorality because we're still going to keep on sinning. We are saved from the wrath of God and the eternal punishment of hell. That's what we're saved from. You got that sermon for free. I'll charge you if you use it. Good discussion. Thank you. Where'd the Pharisees come from? You don't find them in the Old Testament. Where'd they come from? There is scholarly disagreement on where the name Pharisee originated. There's really two big ideas on where it came from. It might have come from the Hebrew word paras, which means to divide or to separate. Because they were separate, we talk about being in the world, not of it. Well, they were the originators of that, I guess. It could also refer to interpreters loosely, as they were separating scriptures and interpreters of the law. So, we call it rightly dividing the word of truth. Well, that kind of goes back to the name Pharisee. The Pharisees, we think, developed from a group called, and forgive me for the pronunciation of this word, the first letter in Hebrew is the Hebrew letter Het, which is a very guttural H. We talk about Hebrew and Aramaic having that Hakalugi kind of language, so it's pronounced the Hasidim, and it literally means the holy ones. You might be familiar with this Hebrew word. Does anyone know the Hebrew word Hesed? Anyone ever heard that? Hesed? We usually translate it in the Old Testament as loving kindness or mercy. It's very popular in the Psalms. It's what I like to call a theological load word, because it describes who God is and what God does. It's almost like John 4 saying, or 1 John 4 saying that God is love. Well, that's who God is, but it's also what God does, right? So that's what that word means. And how do we get like God, and how do we do things like God? We become holy, we become sanctified and cleansed in the eyes of God. Now, we talked about zealots just a minute ago. Well, the Pharisees kind of began that movement because they politically opposed Hellenism. Remember, Hellenism is the influx of Greek culture on Judaism, on Israel, right? So we don't know exactly what brought them to light, but we do know they were a large group and had immense political power in the Palestinian region. The Pharisees and Sadducees were constantly at war with each other, not literally, but politically, fighting for political power, almost like Republicans and Democrats, right? Just constantly trying to fight for that power. I think you see an allusion to this in Scripture, because pay special attention, by the way, when you're reading the Gospels and the Pharisees and scribes are dealing with Jesus alone, the Sadducees deal with Jesus alone, and when the Pharisees and Sadducees are on the same side fighting against Jesus. That shows you just how much of a cultural and religious renegade Jesus was in his day, is when the Pharisees and Sadducees team up to get him. Because they were not friends. It almost seems like they were in Scripture, but they definitely were not. What did the Pharisees believe? Two main things. Number one, obligations to the law, purity, tithing, and Sabbath. So if you're going to be a good Jew, here's what you have to do. You have to obey the law, you have to be pure, you have to tithe, and you have to obey the Sabbath to the fullest extent of the written law and the oral law. And they believed that the oral law was equal to the written law. I think we have a lot of that still today in Christianity, don't we? For example, think about somebody like a great pioneer in the Stone Campbell movement, Barton W. Stone, who rejected the Westminster Confession of Faith. Well, he didn't necessarily reject it. He said, I'll sign this and I'll obey it in so much as I see fit, as it aligns with Scripture. That's what Barton Stone said. At that time, the Presbyterian Church, which Barton Stone was part of, before beginning the Stone Campbell movement, at that time, they had elevated the Westminster Confession of Faith to the point of being equal to Scripture. You could not be a preacher unless you decided to follow and sign your name to the Westminster Confession of Faith. And Barton Stone had a problem with that, which is why now, I believe, I'm a firm believer, I'm working on a PhD, I am a firm believer in education, in formal education. And I think that if you are going to preach or teach, you desperately need to be taught by someone who knows more than you. That doesn't mean going to school, that doesn't mean getting a master's or PhD or whatever, but it means being a diligent student. And that should be the goal of every human being, is to be a diligent student until you die. Okay? But that being said, thanks to men like Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell, the Churches of Christ movement and the Stone Campbell movement, they didn't coin the phrase, but they made famous the phrase sola scriptura, Scripture alone. We're not going to elevate any creed. We're not going to sign our name to a confession. We're going to take Scripture in Scripture by itself. Now that was radical during the time of Stone and Campbell. It was more radical during the time of the Pharisees. So while many believe the main issue between the Pharisees and Sadducees was the resurrection, because the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, this is why they're sad, you see. You might have heard that before. Josephus says it was the way they viewed the oral tradition. The Pharisees do believe in the resurrection, and here's why. In the Old Testament, outside of the Pentateuch, there are allusions and examples of resurrection. So, for example, 1 Kings 18. Elijah raises the widow's son from the dead, right? Clear allusion to resurrection, bodily, physical resurrection. So you have that, and that's what they believe. By the way, the Pharisees believe in angels and heavenly beings and demons and things like that. The Sadducees do not, because in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books, there are no angels and demons and things like that. You might have an allusion to it in Genesis 6 with the Nephilim, but it's not point blank verbally explicit, so they reject it. But the Pharisees did believe in that. Jesus and the Pharisees, at face value, they should agree with each other. Not necessarily because of oral law or anything, but namely because of the resurrection. I mean, Jesus preached the resurrection, didn't he? The temple's going to be destroyed and in 3 days be rebuilt. Clear allusion to resurrection, right? So that's what he preached. They ought to have gotten along. Both were teachers of the people. Both interpreted the law. Both established a philosophy of separation. But Jesus and the Pharisees were constantly condemning each other. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20. You may want to see Matthew chapter 23. I think I said 25 earlier, but it's 23, the woes to the scribes and Pharisees. Matthew 5:20 is an interesting passage. If I'm not mistaken, because I didn't write it down, y'all may have to double check me on this, but if I'm not mistaken, Matthew 5:20 is the passage that says, "Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now wait a minute, I thought the Pharisees were the bad guys. Why say unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees? It's almost a do as I say, not as I do situation. Because the scribes and Pharisees were seen as the best Jews of their day. It's almost like if Jesus was alive today, he might say, unless your righteousness surpasses that of your elders, you will by no means... Now we know that our elders are just men, right? They're just men who have a godly appointing. But they're set to be on that pedestal, to be called to a higher standard. I think that's what Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20. Which is interesting when you get to chapter 23, because he says almost the exact opposite. So why should we care? Why should we care about who the Pharisees are? Of course, Jesus encounters the Pharisees in multiple passages. We've already seen some of those. I think we should seek to teach like the Pharisees. When the Pharisees taught, they did so really in 2 ways that we should adopt. Number one, they taught the public people. The Sadducees are going to be your priestly people. They're going to be your overly political, top of the line, rich people, whatever. The Pharisees sought to teach the people. And number two, the Pharisees are recipients and practicers of this rabbinical teaching of asking questions, answering questions with questions. Jesus does that over and over and over again. He answers questions with questions, and we're thinking, Jesus, please, would you please just tell me the answer to my question? But he doesn't want to tell you the answer to his question because he wants you to figure it out. And that has been proven to be one of the best ways of teaching. Start up discussion, ask questions. Let the audience come to their conclusion, right? So we should seek to teach like the Pharisees. We should seek to practice the things that we teach. The Pharisees don't do that. They teach, but they don't practice it. We need to be practicers of what we preach. And lastly, we can learn humility from those who do not embody it. I'm thinking again of Matthew chapter 6, about those who seek to be first, who want to be seen by everyone. The Pharisee in Luke 18 who prays publicly about how great he is. We can learn a lot from their mistakes. And I heard it said just the other day, I don't remember if it was on the radio or a book or whatever, but it said a smart man learns from his mistakes. A wise man learns from the mistakes of others. I may not be a smart man, but I can be a wise man. I can look at somebody else and pick them apart. So those are some things we learn about the Pharisees. Are there any questions about the Pharisees? I may not be able to answer them, but we'll entertain them at least before we jump into the Sadducees. Everybody good? All right. Let's talk about the Sadducees. When we study a particular group or we study something that has to do with the Bible, I do think it's important for us as preachers and teachers to understand the limits of our study. Well, as we can't know everything. So with the Sadducees, here's the difficulty. Here's the limit. All we know about them comes from their opponents. Now, if all someone knew about you came from your opponent, probably wouldn't say anything good about you, would they? That's the point of being an opponent, right? So they very little is said about them in general, let alone from their opponents. The Sadducees disappear after the destruction of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is destroyed in AD 70 by Vespasian, you recall. This is probably due because the temple is destroyed in AD 70, and if there's no longer a temple, there's no longer a need for priest, right? You can't have priest without a temple. And so the Sadducees were the priest of Jerusalem at this time. They were far less than the Pharisees. As you see on the next point, there were approximately 1,000 of them in Jerusalem. There was about 6,000 to 8,000 Pharisees. So largely outnumbered by the Pharisees. But they also had what we might call an ultra-conservative view. I think we look at the Pharisees a lot of times as we read Scripture and we say, no, these were the conservative ones. That's not true. The Pharisees were the flaming liberals and the Sadducees were the ultra-conservatives. There really was no religious middle ground. I think Jesus brings the middle ground, to be honest with you. But the Sadducees, like we said, they disappear. They're not really around. They are the ultra-conservatives. The Sadducees did not keep records or histories of themselves. Thus, everything we know about them comes from their opponents. As we said, they appear in the split between the Hellenizers and the Hasidim. They disappear after the destruction of Jerusalem. So the Hellenizers, you recall, are the ones who welcomed Greek influence. Right? They're the Jews who said, yeah, this is going to be good for us. And then the Hasidim are the ones from which the Pharisees come. And they say, no, we don't need that at all. The name Sadducee comes from the word sadak, which means righteousness or righteous. That really should be Zadok instead of Sadak, but whatever. The Sadducees were priests because priests were rich. During the intertestamental period, really in the Maccabean period, you have instances of priests buying their way into the priesthood. Now remember, to be a priest, what did you need to be? According to the law, what did you need to be a priest? Does anyone remember? There's several things. Let's hit a couple of them. You had to be a Levite. Very good. What else?
Depending on if it's going to be the priest, you had to be the lineage of Aaron.
Right. Lineage of Aaron. Yep.
Also, they did not have earthly possession, well, per se, because they were given cities by God, and then the people took care of them by what they brought into the temple.
Absolutely. Yep, very good. What about them physically? To be a priest, you couldn't have any birth defect, right? You couldn't have like a speech impediment. There had to be nothing wrong with you. You had to be physically pure, right? That's the qualification to be a priest given by the law. By the time you get to the intertestamental period, Ezekiel chapter 10, the glory of God leaves the temple. God's fed up. He leaves the temple and He's not going to come back until Jesus. Okay? But in the intertestamental period between Malachi and Matthew, you have instances of these priests buying their way into the priesthood for power and authority. Okay? So that's why the Sadducees are wealthy. Because a lot of them bought their way into power and authority. The name Sadducee can be traced back to the priest named Zadok, who was the father of the priest in the days of Solomon. The Sadducees operated from the temple, serving as priests. We talked about that already on the last slide. It's likely that when the chief priests are mentioned in the Bible, they are the Sadducees. They are of the sect of the Sadducees. So going back to the Pharisees, scribe and Pharisee, one group, I believe. Now, y'all can research it yourself and have your own opinion, but I believe scribe and Pharisee, one group. All scribes are Pharisees, not all Pharisees scribes. Chief priests and Sadducees, one group. All chief priests are Sadducees, not all Sadducees are chief priests. Everybody with me? Good. As we mentioned, the Sadducees, far less numerable than the Pharisees. 6-1. We talked about buying the priesthood. Here's an example of that. The priesthood was to be anointed, not bought. Leviticus chapter 8 and verse 10. You remember the priests were anointed. Second Maccabees, this is an extra canonical book of the Bible, if you want to call it that, part of the Apocrypha. In the Catholic Bible, Second Maccabees, First and 2nd Maccabees are included, but we don't include it, and for good reason. But anyways, this is what it says. Later, when King Seleucus died and Antiochus, known as Epiphanes, became king, Jason, the brother of Onias, became high priest by corrupt means. He went to see the king and offered him 27,000 pounds of silver with 6,000 more pounds to be paid later. That's a lot of money, y'all. That's a lot of money. So you see the corruption here. And remember, this is the intertestamental period. We talked a little bit about the Seleucids and Ptolemies and Antiochus Epiphanes and all of that later or previously in our class. I'm going to skip the next slide because it just is more of what happened here. But notice, by the way, I say I'm going to skip it. I'm not. He possessed no other qualifications aside from being rich. He had no qualifications, but he got in. What did the Sadducees believe? They believed only in the written Torah. The written Torah we call the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is a fancy word for the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They rejected the rest of the Old Testament. So from Joshua to Malachi, gone. It's not to say that they didn't accept them as devotional or that they didn't accept them as historic, but they rejected them as inspired. Because of that, they rejected belief in angels and demons. Now we go to Ezekiel and Daniel, and we find angels all over the place. But if I don't believe that that's inspired, I'm not going to believe it. If it's not in the first 5 books, I'm not going to believe it. They rejected the resurrection because it's not mentioned in the Torah. Now, I have up here a side note, Hebrews 11:19, which tells us that Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac because he believed that God would give Isaac back to him. If you read Genesis 22, there is perhaps an inkling of an allusion to resurrection, because Isaac is the son of promise. God had promised it. God by nature cannot violate His covenant. But it seems like He's going to. And so the only option is, if Abraham is going to kill Isaac, then Isaac must be raised from the dead. However, the Sadducees would say, well, he wasn't killed. God stopped him. And so there is no resurrection. So when you find in the Gospels questions to Jesus about the resurrection, they're largely going to come from a Sadducee. Like the question of a woman is married, is it to 7 men, and all of them die? Which one is going to be her husband in the resurrection? I think that one's presented by a Sadducee. They believed that all human affairs resulted from human free will and God was distant from the world. This is incredibly Platonistic in their worldview. It's that kind of deistic idea that God is the grandfather in the clouds, and He's up there kind of watching us, and we can do whatever we want, and God really doesn't care about what goes on down here. Our job is to just make Him happy. I have to admit that seems like a terrible teaching on the relationship that mankind has with God. But if you only accept the first 5 books of Moses, is that not what you're led to believe? Because in the beginning, in Genesis 1 through 3, man has that relationship with God. Man violates that relationship, and now God is distant from them, and the only way that God can have a relationship with them is through perfect keeping of the law, which no one can do. So I understand why they believe these things, but man, I hate that they did. Because if they would have just read on a little more, it would have probably been a little better.
How come they allowed, when they went into the temple, and read about it with Apostle Paul and Barnabas when they were going to the synagogue, that they had the reading of the law, and then also they had some reading from the prophets?
There's a big difference between the temple and the synagogue. That's the reason why. Even today, when you go to synagogues, when you walk into a synagogue, up in the pulpit area, as we would call it, you know how we have the baptistry behind the pulpit? If you walk into a synagogue, they have something like that, but it's not a baptistry. It's like a container for scrolls of the Torah. Up there, that's like the sanctified spot. That's to resemble the most holy place. And you have usually 2 or 3 copies of the Torah, which are the 5 books of Moses. Now, when the rabbi gets up to give the lesson, he'll pull out his own copy of the Old Testament in Hebrew and teach from the writings. But the Torah is up there in the sanctified place. When you go into the temple, you have the Torah. When you go into a synagogue, you have the whole Old Testament. Does that make sense? So there's a difference between the synagogue and the temple. Synagogue was basically created sacred space where there was no sacred space because the dispersal of the Jews. Not everyone could go to Jerusalem to worship anymore. Okay, so maybe that doesn't answer your question, but I think that's largely why we might think that way. Does that make sense?
So what was it that when Jesus went into the temple when he was 12 and he was speaking there,
Mm-hmm.
was he basically coming from the first 5 books, or was he
Yes.
teaching other parts?
Well, okay, 2 things there. The one day I don't bring a Bible with me. All right, I tell you what.
Here you go, I got one here if you need.
I would love that. Thank you.
Sorry.
I got you. Let us go to Luke. Because when in doubt, find out. Okay, let's start in verse 41 of Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2, verse 41. And his parents went to Jerusalem every year for the feast of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, he went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. When they had finished the days, as they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem. Joseph and his mother did not know it, but supposing him to have been in the company, they went a day's journey and sought him among their relatives and acquaintances. They did not find him. They returned to Jerusalem seeking him. So now it was, after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking questions. Misconception number 1, the Bible doesn't say Jesus was teaching them. He was sitting there listening and asking them questions. Okay? And all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. When they saw him, they were amazed, and his mother asked, "Why did you do this to us?" So what we find there is that, thank you for letting me use this, by the way. What we find there are 2 things. Number 1, he's learning, and we're not told what exactly he's learning. I would argue that because he's in the temple, he is learning from the first 5 books of Moses. But the correct answer is we're simply not told. Well, since we're talking about Jesus and the Sadducees, let's continue to talk about him. We view Jesus as a conservative protector of the law, but the Sadducees likely saw him as a radical liberal. Not because he violates the law, and he doesn't follow the oral law, right? That's the Pharisees' problem with him. But Jesus does things. Jesus takes the law and one-ups it, right? The Sermon on the Mount, prime example. You've heard it said, but I say to you. Now, is what he's saying violating that law? Not at all. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. Yeah, don't. I say to you, if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you're committing adultery. That doesn't violate the law, but it one-ups the law, you see. The issue in Matthew 22, verse 23 through 33, and if I'm not mistaken, because heaven forbid I write down a scripture or bring a Bible with me, goodness, is the question of the woman who's been married, who's her husband going to be in the resurrection. The issue here is not on marriage. It's the issue of the resurrection. The Sadducees are trying to catch Jesus in a qualm about the resurrection. Okay. Problems surrounding the Sadducees. In John chapter 2, verse 12 through 22, by the way, this is in all the Gospels. Just in John, it's at the beginning rather than the end. In the other Gospels, it's at the end. But the temple had become a den of thieves rather than just providing a sacrifice for someone when they need it. And Jesus addresses that, right? He cleanses the temple. And I would argue he does it twice, once at the beginning of his ministry and once at the end. But he cleanses the temple. And who's running the temple? It's the rich Sadducees. Okay? The Sadducees were seen as shrewd and constantly needing to keep the status quo. They treated each other as foreigners. So why were the Sadducees so few? Because they couldn't even get along. Okay? They didn't like each other. And that's from Josephus' Jewish Wars 2.166. If anybody wants to write that, you can Google this and it'll pop up. So here's what the Sadducees believed. They denied fate. They denied the existence of angels, the existence of demons, the resurrection, and life after death. What a terrible, sad way to live. I don't understand how you can believe in the monotheistic God of the Shema, which is Deuteronomy 6:1. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. I don't know how you could believe in that God and not see these things. Angels and demons, okay, fine, if you only accept the first 5 books. Resurrection, I think it's in there. I can make allusions to it, but still. Fate, yeah, whatever. But life after death, what do you do at the end of Genesis, in Genesis 50, when Joseph dies and he's said to be gathered to his fathers? I think that goes beyond him being buried at the same place where he's buried. The phrase, gathered to his fathers, is used in the entire Old Testament. I know they reject the entire Old Testament, but just go with me. It's used in the entire Old Testament to talk about these people moving on to the afterlife where their forefathers were. A conscious existence after death. So why should we care about the Sadducees? Number one, many Christians today claim to be Christians yet refuse to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. You cannot be a Christian and refuse to believe in the resurrection. I know a lot of instances where people will say, well, he was a good teacher and he died. Then that's it. No, that is not it. The hero died, but don't worry, he comes back. The Sadducees refuse to believe in angels and demons. It's beyond the scope of this class to talk about a study of angels and demons, but I think a study of angels and demons would be beneficial for our churches. I think we have a false view of angels and a false view of demons. Angels are not the little cherub beings that go around shooting people in the rear ends with a bow and arrow. They are warriors. They are warriors of God. They are His secret service, if you will. Not all, but some. And they don't believe in that. So, okay, enough on that. Next point. They act as if God is far and distant rather than moving and active. When you read Acts chapter 17, when Paul is in Athens speaking in the Areopagus to the Epicureans and the Stoics, he says that God, who does not live in a temple made with hands. Right? He's He's moving and active. He's in the world, and he can't be bound by that. The Sadducees were the so-called know-it-alls of the first century due to their education and social standing. We would think of that because they're priests, right? I mean, if you have a question about the Bible, who do you go to? You go to your preacher, right? Well, same is true with the Sadducees. You have a question about the law, you go to the Sadducees.
Is that why I noticed the verse that you was reading a little while ago, in the King James Version, instead of saying, where's that verse at again? But it describes, instead of saying, here it is, 46, it says, teachers, but in the King James Version it says in the midst of doctors.
Yeah, right. Because the Latin, and the King James is translated largely from the Latin Vulgate, right, that Jerome translated, and the word doctora in Latin just means teacher. It doesn't mean medical professional, it just means teacher. So there you go.
The fact is, when you say the Sadducees were known as the know-it-alls, well, I think about some people today that claim to be know-it-alls, or some of these that sort of has the word doctor in front
That's
of
right.
names or degrees, and not all of them are that smart.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's why I was wondering why they had the word doctor there, because they think, sort of like what it says right there, they think they know it all.
Right.
But really they don't.
Right. And the last point here, and will wrap us up for tonight, but we have Sadducees in the church today, don't we? We have people who, and I think a lot of times preachers and teachers are at the top of the list when it comes to these kinds of people who do have that know-it-all attitude. And I mean, how many times for the gentlemen in here have we given a sermon and someone critiqued us and we got our feelings hurt, but then we went back and realized, hey, they were right. Now you talk about a horse pill to swallow, that is one. But we're thankful for it because it makes us better.